Section 1 of this class is on the question of political authority. We start with political authority because it deals with perhaps the most fundamental question in political theory, which is, who made you boss? Tom Cristiano, in his article for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, does a nice job outlining different possible answers to this question. He also does a good job clarifying the different kinds of questions that political authority sometimes is thought to mean. For example, what gives government the right to command you? What gives you an obligation to obey that command? And finally, what gives them the right to enforce that command? For anarchists, of course, all these questions are answered in the same way and in the negative. Nothing gives anyone else the right to tell anyone else what to do or to force them to do anything on the anarchist view, at least not automatically. Respect for people means respecting their autonomy, and autonomy just simply means the right to rule yourself, or the right to give a law unto yourself. But everyone, and even anarchists, concede that you can consent to someone having authority over you, and therefore, if you consent to it, someone can have a right to tell you what to do. Now, this idea that consent is a non-controversial foundation for the permission to rule is what gives rise to an idea which has influenced all of political theory for the last 200-300 years, and that's social contract theory. The idea that the people of a country establish a contract with one another, that they agree amongst themselves to put in place a government to secure the collective goods that they cannot secure on their own. Things like national defense, environmental protection, or traffic laws. Social contract theory has been really highly influential in the West, where government is usually thought to be authorized by the consent of the governed. These ideas, even though they started in the West, have been exported all over the world. Indeed, one of our major exports has been our social and political ideas. They've been exported to India, which is the world's largest democracy, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, all continents have been influenced by social contract theory. Now, although the idea that your personal consent can permit someone to do something that they otherwise would be forbidden to do, like, for instance, touch you, or command you, or punish you, that idea is not very controversial. But what is controversial is whether we in fact have consented to any such arrangement. And if we have, then what is it exactly that we consented to? After all, do you remember signing any documents? Were you asked to swear a solemn oath? And what are the terms of this contract, or alleged contract? Does anyone know what the terms actually are? Where are they written down? And if you can find the contract, then who gets to resolve the disputes that you might have about the contract and its terms when new situations the contract could not foresee end up arising? John Locke and Thomas Hobbes provide two classical formulations of consent theory in the social contract. They're not the only ones. Kant and Rousseau and Grotius, Pufendorf and other sort of classical social contract theorists came up with their own slightly different versions, but John Locke and Thomas Hobbes are definitely a good place to start. John Locke thinks that by remaining in a country, we tacitly consent to be ruled, and that when disputes arise between, say, the governed and the government, that the people are the ultimate arbiters. Hobbes, on the other hand, thinks that by obeying the laws, we essentially consent to them. We're always free, in some sense, to become outlaws, even though that's not in our best interest, but no one said freedom was easy, Hobbes might say. While many people in America think that there's a kind of voluntary agreement in place between the citizens in order to establish a government, critics of consent theory worry that the social contract doesn't really describe our political arrangements all that well. So Michael Huemer, whom you'll get to read in a little bit, sums up some of these concerns in his book, The Problem of Political Authority. Michael Huemer worries that our consent is pretty much meaningless since the laws are going to be enforced on us no matter what we say. You could imagine going out with a young man or a young lady, and they ask you whether they can kiss you, and but they tell you no matter what you do, it doesn't matter, they're going to kiss you anyway. It seems that your consent at that point doesn't matter, and it seems like our government works a lot that way. Even if we expressly deny them the permission to enforce their laws on us, they're going to do it anyway. And so it's just not clear at what level our consent actually matters. And if it doesn't matter, then it can't authorize in the way we would like it to authorize the government's actions. Humer also think that elections and the option to leave are also really problematic because they presuppose an entity with the right to force us to make a choice, like an electoral choice or the choice to leave. And of course, it's the existence of that very authority, that is to say, an authority that has the right to make you make those kinds of choices, that needs to be justified. And so those sorts of arguments that start with elections or the right to leave if you're not happy seem to presuppose that very thing which needs to be proven, namely political authority. So, even though Humer is a bit of an anarchist when it comes to authority, others have come up with alternate strategies to consent theory in the face of these many problems with consent theory and the social contract. If consent doesn't really seem to describe what appear to be essentially non-voluntary political arrangements, right? We're born into a society. No one gives you a choice about being an American citizen, or if you're not American, whatever citizenship you have, you usually didn't get because you chose it. You got it because you were born to it. And so political society and political citizenship just doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that one acquires voluntarily, and so consent and contract don't seem to be the appropriate model to analyze them. But if it's not consent and contract, then what can do the job? Well, maybe some people suggest reciprocity can do the job. And of course, reciprocity has a very long tradition. You guys have to read Plato's Crito, in which Plato's teacher, Socrates, is one of the characters, and Socrates has some arguments about why he owes Athens his life. And part of his approach is to say that, look, the laws that protect us deserve our protection and allegiance, and they deserve our protection even when those laws don't end up working out in our favor. And of course, in the case of Socrates, they really didn't work out in his favor. John Simmons, whom you get to read in a little while, is skeptical of reciprocity, or what he calls gratitude. In this case, reciprocity and gratitude are going to mean the same thing, or at least they're going to be similar enough to count as one kind of strategy for justifying political authority. He's skeptical of gratitude, and his criticisms present a fairly profound challenge to those who think that just receiving benefits is going to be enough to constitute good enough reasons for obeying government. And that's quite aside from providing a justification for the coercive enforcement of government laws. For example, Simmons argues that reciprocity can definitely put you in someone's debt, but it's very difficult to see why receiving a gift puts you under someone's jurisdiction, right? When you receive a gift from your parents at Christmas, or when you receive a gift from your friends, that doesn't give them a right to tell you what to do. It just gives you an obligation to repay the gift. And so reciprocity and gratitude just doesn't seem to be, for those reasons and other reasons, those don't seem to be promising strategies to justify political authority. So where does that leave us? Do we have to resign ourselves to be anarchists? Well, John Rawls, who we're going to read later in the semester, thinks that we might be able to appeal to something he calls, well, actually he doesn't call it this, but something you might call a hypothetical social contract. A kind of contract that each and every one of us would have signed if we'd been given the opportunity, and if only at the time we were rational and reasonable. Right? So everyone should or ought to sign this contract because it embodies something about what's right in the world, or what's right in terms of political institutions. Others appeal to principles of fair play or simple consequentialism or instrumentalism. But all these theories have their own problems, and we don't have time to go over all of them in this class. I'm just presenting you some of the greatest hits, as it were. So, in conclusion, I want to say that rather than being what you might say decisively settled, the conversation about political authority is ongoing. And yet, at the same time, although the problem's not settled, the desirability of establishing a framework of laws that help us interact peacefully and productively with one another is still no less urgent. So we still need some account, some justification for what ultimately we know we need. And this is why I've invited you to address questions of political authority in your first essay.